So, Hebrews 12 from 18 to 29 is what my text is going to be. Let's start. For you have not come to a mountain that can be touched, that is burning with fire, to darkness, gloom, and storm, to a trumpet blast or to such a voice speaking words that those who heard it begged no further word be spoken to them because they could not bear what was commanded. Even if an animal touches the mountain, it must be stoned to death. The sight was so terrifying that Moses said, I am trembling with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. If they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less will we if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth. But now he has promised, once more, I will shake not only the earth, but the heavens. The words once more indicate the removal of what can be shaken, that is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful. So we worship God acceptably with reverence and with awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Quite some text you got there. Some imagery that I kind of, when I first read it, was like, it can't really be saying that. So let me just go back here. So this first 18 to 21, the imagery is from Exodus and Deuteronomy. He's taken some direct quotes from there. And it's kind of scary, wouldn't you? Like, when I read it, I was like, this is very scary language. Of course, now, don't get me wrong. God is mighty. He is completely other. He is holy. There is no one like him. And he is powerful. But this seems to bring across, maybe we should be a little bit more scared of him than we should, or like that we are. Is that what the Hebrew writer means? So you'll understand with me, I have lots of questions, I have lots of rabbit trails, I have lots of, like, why is he saying this like this? My head was busy this last week. Look, I've been thinking about this for a while. So if you go back and read Exodus 19, and I'm challenging you all, don't just take my word for it. Go back and read the text and become as confused as I did when you started reading it. But I'll explain some little tricks along the way. Sinai, you kind of get the impression that God's presence on Mount Sinai, the Israelites weren't really supposed to go up there, right? If you read that first 19 to 1 until about 20 odd. There was thunder and there was lightning, and it was very, very frightening. Sorry, I can't resist that. Mamma mia. So remember that all of these are descriptions of God's presence. They were tangible. It was what we call a manifestation of God's presence on a physical mountain that occurred. The words are very intense, like burning fire. Well, fire naturally burns, so why would you say burning fire? It was super hot, right? It was uncomfortable. It's not like when you see a fire and you know, let's go jump on the fire. No. You want to get warmed up by the fire, but you don't want to go in the fire, right? Darkness, storm, clouds, and even the word gloom. Now, I looked up all the different translations, and the word gloom is used in all of them. So I was like, why on earth would it be gloomy? what I found this quite funny. So apparently they couldn't bear the terrible commandments that even a poor animal, as much as touched the mountain, either they were shot with arrows because guns didn't exist then, or they were stoned to death. So that's what the Hebrew writer brought out of a text that says any human or animal. So I was just thinking of Gary's sister. Sometimes she cares more about humans than she does cares more about animals than she does about humans. So clearly the Hebrew writer was an animal lover because he was more concerned that the poor animals were going to get stoned. Even apparently Moses was so terrified that he was trembling in fear. So this kind of gives you this who's this God? It doesn't really want to go and say, hi. Hi, Dad, it's me. No. Okay, so he comes across as quite scary. Fire imagery in the Hebrew, ancient people, they meant one thing in terms of when they were telling stories. And this was basically God's manifest presence. If you go through Moses in the burning bush, think about Acts when they had, what did they have on their heads? Tongues of fire. Okay, so I'm training you to think that when you read stuff in the Bible and you see this kind of imagery, this is what they're telegraphing, this is what they're telling you. Think God's presence. Okay. I've got a big word for you, another one. I have practiced it. I go to Google and then they give you the little thing of how to pronounce the name. So theophany. This is what they call a personal, visible counter of Yahweh. I'm putting Yahweh in, but they say kind of a deity or God. And this refers to a temporary, spatial manifestation, which is like stuff you can see, feel, and hear, of God in some kind of tangible form or an extraordinary visual display. So I would say a mountain that has clouds on it with fire burning is a pretty extraordinary visual display. So that's what we call theophany. So is it that God is that unapproachable because of his holiness and that angry and that frustrated with humans that he needs Jesus, by contrast, if you read the text, because he says by contrast, Mount Zion and all that Jesus is the one to, let's say, soften God's anger and make him more approachable, like make him less angry with us. And there's some of you that are probably thinking, yeah, that sounds right. It makes sense, but does it? Is there more at play here than our Western minds that we don't know? Or is there another point that the writer is trying to tell us? Maybe our lenses that we are wearing, how we view God, needs changing. So I'm going to mess with your lenses, I'm going to mess with your grids, and I'm going to mess with your frameworks about who God is, especially Old Testament, right? I love it. It's so much fun. Okay, Exodus 19. We're going to do a little bit of a recap here. So whatever Sinai represents today, so your groundwork, it's not about salvation. It's not about salvation. They were already delivered, rescued before they got to Mount Sinai. And it's not like God went around, you know that angel of death that was flying around? It's not like he checked inside their homes and like, is there an idol here? Has this guy been behaving, like Father Christmas list? Were you good this week, this year? He rescued them despite them. Okay. So that's your foundational thing. That you put that in first. This is like Gospel 101. Okay. They didn't behave and then to get rescued. God rescued them despite they were whining. Exodus 19 verse 4 says, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt. That's pretty cool summary of what God, basically saying God messed with every single idol and deity and God that they knew in Egypt, and they had a lot. Every plague represented, and God took out either the worship of that deity or God, or messed with their heads about what that particular deity or God with every single plague, including the Red Sea, because they were when they went through, it's the Reed Sea, but when they went through that was messing with the God as well. He messed with every single one. And he was like, guess who I am and guess who your gods are. And then he says, I bore you on the wings of eagles. In other words, you did nothing. I did it all for you. And I brought you to myself. Summary done. So they leave Egypt. Takes them 3 months of traveling through the desert to get to Mount Sinai. You could say that their GPS was a little different to ours. Today, Siri, or maybe Waze, will be telling you to reroute because they literally were not taking the shortest route possible to get there. And so now so the context that we find ourselves today, which I'm going to be what the Hebrew writer is talking about, is now they are camping at a mountain range called Horeb. It's horrible, Horeb. And Mount Sinai is a summit in this mountain range, just to help you. So when you see Horeb, you know Sinai is associated with that. Okay. Their journey has been, up until this point, has been jam-packed with lots of action. It's like an action movie, stuff happening, miracles, Red Sea parting. It's been lots and lots of stuff on the go. And then suddenly we get to this point in the text and everything slows down to almost like a grinding halt. And to our modern minds becomes mind-numbingly boring from about Exodus 19. There's a few like cool stories in between, golden calf stuff, but everything starts to become like, what are they going on about? Why? Because God takes a year. This is a full calendar year that God takes of downloading his plans, the 10 commandments, lots of rules and thou shalt nots, and the blueprints for the tabernacle, and he takes a year doing it. 3 months of action, a whole year of, really? This is how you got to live. So we get a bit bored. Maybe it's outdated for us. I mean, who has read Leviticus? I remember when we went through the CBR thing and we all got to Leviticus, we were like, what? For some entertainment, let's go read Leviticus. So what's the big deal about Mount Sinai in our modern minds? This is the cool thing. Sinai is actually the focal point. So if you read the text, and they are pretty clever, the Hebrew writers, we live in a visual world. Everything is visual for us. We don't live in an oral hearing culture. So their stories had to be pretty clever in order for people to remember them. So for the ancient Hebrew, Sinai was the focus. So you've got Genesis. Can I make a little? There's no green button. Oh, there. No. No, it's not green anymore. Okay, it's the red button. Okay, so Genesis is there. Deuteronomy's there. Woo. This is what we call the Torah, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the Torah. That's what we know as the Torah. Guess what the focal point of the Torah is? So from chapter 19 to chapter Numbers 10 to about verse 11, I think it's 57 chapters, is the focal point of the Torah. For them, it's the crown jewel. We're like, what? And guess what? When the Israelites arrived, they remember their agenda was to worship. But for them, Mount Sinai was where they got to meet their God. So I don't know if you know, this is like a literary focal point. So we all know what the Last Supper, that painting by Da Vinci, that Jesus is the focal point and everything is pointing towards Jesus. The whole composition of the painting goes towards, this is what the Torah does. The focal point, it's called a chiasm. Okay. Maybe I pronounced that wrong. So every story before Mount Sinai and every story after Mount Sinai, they mirror each other. So if there was a story of, I can't think of anything now, but if there's a story of this, then there's an opposite story or another story that mirrors the same story after Mount Sinai. They're very clever like this. So when they arrived at Mount Sinai, they were like this motley crew of slaves or liberated slaves, but still mentality-wise, they were slaves. They didn't really know who they were. They were Hebrew, but they weren't really Hebrew or Jewish. They had some foreigners with them. They were completely disorganized. And they get to Mount Sinai. You go and read Numbers 10, verse, I think it's 11 or 12. When they leave out by tribe, marching, registered citizens, and a well-organized army. So do you think God has done something with him in that year? So another thing to realize is biblical writers are very deliberate with their hyperlinks. You know, you go onto the internet and you see a word that's like hyperlinked. They do the same thing. It just wasn't as easy. Then you got to go find the scroll and then. But they were doing this deliberately to reference stories and points. So certain words like fire would think, oh, okay, that's the point, that's the reference, it's God's presence. They did that throughout their story. So when you read the Bible, think, what does this remind me of, this wording? It's deliberate. What does it remind me of? Oh, okay, it reminds me of that. So that's how you read the Bible. The Hebrew writer did the same thing. So I'm like, okay, there's something in here that he wants us to go into. So what is the big deal about Sinai? So they receive God's self-revelation. They literally get to witness God himself in the presence. They receive their calling to become a royal priesthood. In the beginning of Exodus 19, God tells Moses, this is what I want you to tell the people, that you are my royal priesthood and a holy nation. It's about identity and about calling and about purpose. So that's what Sinai is doing for them, right? So a lady called Carmen Imes, she's a professor, I think in Southern California now. So she said this, he saved them first, then gave them the gift of that goes with salvation. Instructions on how to live as free men and women. Do you know that we actually need to be instructed on how to be free and how to live life as free people? They realized true freedom required clearly communicated boundaries. It was a gift. And then later on she writes, Israel's laws were the fences in which life can flourish. Isn't that a really cool way of looking at it? So we look at the 10 Commandments and all those, what feels like hundreds of millions of laws of what they can't do. But they look at it very differently. If you go read Psalm 119 and talks about God's word, it's a treasured gift. And I think we need a little bit of a mind reset or maybe a reboot in terms of how we view God's word. So, Mount Sinai was actually a place of covenant, and there were terms of the covenant. It wasn't an unconditional one. Salvation was unconditional. This covenant, however, comes in with God's like, I'm going to do stuff, but you also got to do stuff because we're going to do this together, right? These instructions. So we understood the 10 Commandments. That's really badly translated word, commandments, because we think legislated laws. So if you do this, then you'll go to jail or pay a fine or that. This is more like instructions of like, hey guys, this is pretty wise living. So the 10 Commandments translated from the Hebrew word actually is 10 words of instructions rather than the 10 Commandments. They were not legislated laws. And it's a call for a different way of living. Why? What does holy nation mean? Holy means you're set apart. You're different from the rest of the world. Why? So that you can show the world who your God is. So if you live a different way, people are going to go, hey, there's something different about you. Who's the God that you serve? That's the whole point. It was an invitation to a daily commitment and ordinary faithfulness. We want the the big moments, but actually God's calling us to a daily faithfulness and in the ordinary. It was to ensure peace between all the family members. I mean, those with kids, you kind of know that sometimes you've got to have some kind of house rules, right? Because kids will be kids. If you look at it and reframe it as if this is God's family house rules for us to live life. You know, because what's really good for the individual is good for the family. What's good for the family is good for the individual. So you should not kill is pretty good for the family, right? And for yourself, because no one's going to kill you. Or like, don't covet your neighbor's wife. That's going to be good for you and for the family. See, Gary, it's in the Bible. But the don't kill part, I suppose I have to, because my joke with Gary is if he ever was to cheat on me, I'd kill him. But it's fine, babe, I'll raise you from the dead and then you'll be okay. There's no fear in our relationship. But actually, the most important thing is this last one. It's to show the exclusive loyalty towards their God. That's why they lived, and that's why God gave all these things. So, going back to Hebrews, in verse 20, it says that God's voice was so fearful and his commandments were so fearful that they couldn't actually bear it. What is the Hebrew writer going on? Because this doesn't seem to track between this incredible loving Father God and this God where people are so scared of him that they're scared he's going to kill animals. Maybe it's a case of a broken telephone. If you read first part of Exodus 19, you see that poor Moses, he must have been a really fit guy. How many times he went up that mountain and came down again? It was a lot. So maybe it was a case of, and occasionally he took his elders with him, and they went up on the mountain, they met at a certain spot, and then they came back down again. So maybe they're telegraphing, or they're kind of communicating what God was saying to them. They didn't represent God well to the people. So maybe that was the case of what the author was trying to say. So maybe it was broken telephone. Okay, well, let's go and check it out. Deuteronomy 29. So the way that they write their stories wasn't ever in chronological order. So that's why it gets a bit confusing, because some stuff gets reiterated and said over again because it's important. So this is just one of the times that God's clear about his instructions. So it says, follow carefully the terms of this covenant so that you may prosper in everything you do. All of you are standing here today in the presence of the Lord, your God, your leaders, your chief men, your elders and officials, and all the other men of Israel, together with your children and your wives. Okay, so they've got everyone. Hang on, there's more. And the foreigners living in your camps who chop your wood and carry your water. So no one's left out. You are standing here in order to enter into a covenant with the Lord your God, a covenant the Lord is making with you this day and sealing it with an oath, to confirm this day as his people, that he may be your God. Goes on. Just as he promised you, and he swore by your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So that's just to remind them of the original promise. This is what the covenant is ratifying. It's kind of saying it's the same kind of deal. I'm making this covenant with its oath, not only that you who are standing here today with us in the presence of the Lord our God, but also with those who are not here today. I think he's talking about dead people. You yourselves know how we lived in Egypt and how we passed through the countries on the way here. You saw among them their detestable images and idols of wood and stone, of silver and gold. Make sure that there's no man or woman or clan or tribe among you today whose heart turns away from the Lord our God to go and worship the gods of those nations. So I think he's pretty clear. So everyone was standing there, including the people who, like the water boy was even there. Rassie Erasmus was there. Wood chopper. No one was left out of the hearing of that. So it wasn't forced on them. They knew what they were saying yes to. This was an invitation so that you will be my people and I will be your God. So there's an element of a belief element, but there's also a loyalty component to this. And up until this point, their role was passive. Okay. They clearly respond by saying yes. You can see it a few times. It tells you a few times. They repeat the stories a few times. They go, yes, we want this. Sign us up. And then, again, in Exodus 24, it says they were given all the words of God, all the rules, and then the people answered in one voice, we agree to this. Okay, so clearly it wasn't that broken telephone kind of story. All right, so what is the Hebrew writer going on about? Like, why is he mentioning all these images? So one thing to remember is God's purity requires ritual purity from us. You can't just walk in before Jesus. Remember my preach on holiness in the beginning of the year? I think it was. Whenever. Time's a bit of a blur. Before COVID, after COVID, everything's a blur. So there were literally boundaries that they had to put in place for their safety so that you couldn't just force yourself into God's presence without being ritually pure, right? So because this is sacred space, God's literal presence was on that mountain. And the moment he touched that mountain, the same as when Moses and the burning bush, which didn't burn up, so that was maybe you can say burning fire then, but it's not really burning. He had to take his shoes off. Why? What did they say? You're standing on holy ground. The ground becomes holy because God's there. And us in our human frailty and because of sin, we can't touch it. Why? Because you will die. So God's presence manifested himself there. So maybe that's the point. So maybe what he's trying to say is that actually, with contrasting with Jesus and Mount Zion, we get to go in. Even the NIV gives us thing where it says the heading of Hebrews 12, verse 18 says the mountain of fear versus the mountain of joy. And I'm like, does this language fit to who I know God is? And I'm like, I don't know. Exodus 19 says, I think I've got it here. Put the limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the foot of the mountain is to be put to death. Notice God's not killing them. They are to be stoned or shot with arrows, and not a hand is to be laid on them. Something interacts. When something that's not pure touches something highly pure like God, that something interacts. They couldn't even touch the dead body. But listen to this. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they approach the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people, consecrated the people. That's another way of saying that they may become ritually pure. And they washed their garments. They also weren't allowed to have sex for 3 days. Okay, sorry guys. And then he said to the people, be ready for the third day. So ready, some of you are thinking, third day, Jesus. Okay, good. I'm training you well. But now listen. It says that they could approach the mountain only after they washed their clothes for 3 days. There wasn't a huge amount of ritual purity that they had to enter into. It was just, will you listen to what God is saying? So, I'm going to go back to this chiasm. So what's immediately it's not apparent to us when you read the text, is in the midst of this. So you've got Moses going up the mountain, people saying yes to the covenant. Then there's the 10 commandments, blah, 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 blah. And then a little funny story in the middle of the block of instructions, because Then there's another story about the 42 laws or the 42 instructions, and then Moses goes up the mountain and people say yes. That's a really funny way of, like you can see this is not in chronological order. Because the point of this little story in Exodus isn't about Moses going up the mountain. It obviously is, it's important. The most important thing is the people's response. These stories mirror each other for a reason, because they're pointing to one very thing, and the people failed their test. So I'm going to read Exodus 20. So this is in Exodus 19, the biblical chiasm, but in Exodus 20, they give you the exact details of what happened, more detail of how it worked out. So when the people saw the thunder and the lightning, which is all very, very frightening, can't resist, and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, which is again another thing of the altar presence of God, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." And here I think is probably one of the saddest sentences in the Old Testament. The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. I think the Hebrew writer is pulling on this. I think he's highlighting this. See, because Mount Sinai and all the descriptions are actually associations with Eden as well, sacred space. If you look at Mount Sinai, they had all these various degrees of holiness right at the top. Holy of Holies. Go and read it and see. We have to remember, none of this was new to them. The fire, the cloud. Guess what was guiding them every single day since they left Egypt? Pillar of cloud. Cloud by day, fire at night. None of this was new. It wasn't as if they were like, "Oh, fire. Oh, that's a new thing." In fact, the fire protected them from the Egyptians before they went through the sea. And to the Egyptians, I think it says that the cloud was, to the Egyptians, for them it was dark, but for the Israelites it was light. The fire kept them warm at night. God's presence was already with them in a manifestation that they could see, experience, and feel. They knew what it represented and who it represented. Those limitations that were put in place about don't go near the mountain, otherwise somebody's going to get stoned or poor animals going to get stoned or shot, was only set in place for those 3 days. It was temporary. They weren't consecrating themselves for nothing. They were consecrating themselves to go into God's presence, to go on the mountain, to be with Him. And then it says the trumpet sound, if you read the story, it talks about it became louder and louder and louder. So just think about it. Use your imaginations. So God's like, okay, 3 days, consecrating yourself, you're washing your garments. You can imagine all the mother's like, "Oh my word, this is such a pain. There's so much dust. Why are we doing this?" Can you imagine? And then the children come and get themselves dirty again. I'm sorry, my brain. Anyway, they do it. They get ready. And the trumpet blasts, which is another symbol for God's voice. But it gets louder and louder. Why do you think that is? Because the people weren't coming closer. They stayed away. So God was giving them, I see grace in this, God was giving them another chance. So, I have a trumpet sounds. Where's Dylan? Okay, no one's moving. Blast it again. And if you read in John, there's an interesting thing where they hear God's voice, audible voice hearing. To some people, they heard a trumpet sound. To others, they heard God's voice. So I wonder whether it's saying they heard the trumpet sound because they were...
Again.
We can't turn Siri off. It's very irritating. But listen, think about it. God's going, you're ready now. You can come to me. And they don't respond. You're ready now. Trust me. You can come in. I promise you, you won't die. They don't respond. In fact, I think it even suggests that they move back because it says they stayed at a distance. Moses even pleads with them. And he's like, come on, guys, this is just a test. I know, I've been there. I'm alive. I was there. This is the same mountain, the same space where Moses encountered the burning bush. The same place. God promised Moses that they would come back with Israel and worship him in that same space. Can you imagine how desperate Moses must be feeling? Come, follow me. If you don't trust God, trust me that I trust him. No. So they decided, don't let God speak for us, or we will die. Does that wording not remind you of something else? A little bit of an exaggeration. Who exaggerated what would happen if somebody ate the fruit? Who do you think they were listening to? So all these words are keys, hyperlinks, references to remind you to think, use your brains to think, what does that remind me of? They did the same. They literally did in Adam and Eve. And yet God was still gracious because he still went through with the covenant. Even though he spoke through Moses, he still put everything in place. He had spent 3 months training them. Remember all the water, the manna, all of that in the desert to get to Mount Sinai? All of those were tests to prove how faithful he is. So we have a bad associate. I think I'll talk to the kids now. Hey, guys, when you hear your teacher's going to give you a test next week, Monday, you don't really, I know you guys jump for joy. Hey? Josh's face. He's like, wait, what? They're like, yes, we're getting a test. Okay, there might be maybe that 0.1%, like that one child who loves tests. Hey? But most of you going, we got to study. So we don't really have a good association with the test, right? But the reason for it is because it depends on who's giving the test, not taking the test, but who's giving the test. So in Adam and Eve's case with the shiny serpent, he was testing them. What was he wanting? He was like, I'm going to test you because I want you to know that God is not trustworthy. Can you trust him? When God tests us, and I'm sorry, Angela, we will get tested. It's to prove how much we love him, and it's to prove our loyalty to him. The nature of his testing is so that we come out stronger, purer, and we look more like Jesus. So then why did the Hebrew writer say that Moses was trembling with fear? He was cross. So that context. So when you see in your Bibles, it's easy nowadays. You've got those little numbers and you click on the numbers and then the verse pops up. Go and do that. It's so much fun. Moses was trembling with fear, not because he was scared of God. He was trembling in fear for the Israelites. The context of that little quote was the golden calf. What did these numbnuts do? 3 months. Let's say it's 6 months into the year that they're in, a year and a half. Didn't God just say to them, remember the Egyptians? Remember the idols? Remember the detestable images that they made? Remember? They forgot. What did they do? They literally took all the gold that they took from the Egyptians and they made an idol. Why? Because Moses had gone off into the mountain and because they had chosen to stay. So I heard the story of a professor. So somebody had said, it was a professor who's like, guys, I've got this amazing news for you today. Guess what? You all have free scholarships. Who wants one? Put up your hand. It's for the year. Who would like one? Rach, would you like one? Yeah. Chloe? Yeah? Anyone else? Free scholarship. Cool. All you need to do is come with me outside and just wait. I've got to go to the office and sort out everything. But just stay here. And just wait. So the whole class was like, obviously, we're going to give horse in the mouth. We're going to go with and go and wait. And then they start waiting and waiting. And then after a while, somebody's like, oh, this seems too long. I think she was joking. They start grumbling. And then the other person's like, oh, man, I don't have time for this. And somebody else says, oh, I don't trust her. I think she's going to just leave us standing here for the rest of our lives, and nothing's going to come out. So some of them left. And it was a couple of hours later, she eventually comes back, sorry, guys. Oh, where did everyone go? There was maybe one person left. It's the same with the Israelites. They're like, Moses, you talk for us. You go ahead. You be our mediator. We don't want to. We're scared of God. We're going to stand there. And then they got bored of waiting, misrepresented God to themselves, and then built an idol. So I think Moses would be struggling. He's like, 40 days he was up there, 40 nights, 40 days. He comes down with the 10 commandments or the 10 words or the 10 instructions. It's a treaty. It's the covenant. And what have they done? They've got a beautiful golden calf and they're worshiping it. And he's like, oh. So then he goes back up the mountain for another 40 days, but this time he falls prostrate before God for 40 days. He's interceding for them. He didn't eat bread. He didn't eat water. Eat water. No, you can't eat water. But he didn't drink it either. Because of all the sin you guys had committed and doing what was evil in the Lord's sight and arousing his anger. There's one thing, if you read the Bible, that will ignite God's anger like nothing else, and that's idolatry. He can put up with our imperfections. He can even put up with our stupid, sinful choices. He can put up with a lot. But when there's idolatry, his anger gets aroused. That's why Moses was trembling. I changed my order in my... Okay. I didn't do it in my slides. So remember I said to you that they leave Sinai, this organized, registered, marching tribe by tribe. It says here, make sure, sorry, ignore me, I'm a bit lost there. Well, don't ignore me from now. Ignore what I said delete that last part, not this part. The whole point is, in the middle of this Hebrews text, it says, make very sure, I'm taking this out of the Passion Translation because I think it communicates really well what the author's saying. Make very sure that you never refuse to listen to God when he speaks. For the God who spoke on earth from Sinai is the same God who now speaks from heaven. He still loves you. That song, He is for you, He is for you, He is for you, that's taken out of text I think it's in Exodus or in that time period. the blessing. If we turn our backs on God. In other words, he's saying, don't be like the Israelites. You know, we run the risk where, because Gary and I and the staff are full-time, like in a church, we run the risk of going, okay, you do the work for me, you listen to God for me. We hang on prophetic words, but we don't hear for God for ourselves. It's too much of that. Because you can go into God's presence and hear him for yourself. And that is an incredibly powerful thing. Because you can always doubt when other people, which is what happened with Moses, you can always doubt maybe they didn't hear quite right. Maybe they didn't communicate it well. Maybe they misrepresented God. All of that comes into play. Mount Sinai was temporary. The limitations, the boundaries, everything was temporary. I'm going to go back to... Eventually, it became only the priests could go into God's presence, and then only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies. People chose to stay at a distance. Yes, they had a new earthly family, so some stuff goes through, but it was limited in what they could and couldn't do, and they had to be ritually pure to get there. However, with Mount Zion, where we are, what we have is this unshaken kingdom that's permanent. We've already entered into God's presence. And it talks about the angels having this joyous occasion, like this big party up. Why do you think they're having a party? They're welcoming new members into their family. It's a blended family, heavenly family, God's earthly family, God's heavenly family. We're meant to be one. And guess what? There are no more limits. Because the veil is torn between the Holy of Holies. We get to go onto the top of the mountain to be with God. We get to be in the Holy of Holies. We don't need a mediator. We have Jesus. He is our mediator. The blood is already there. That's why in Hebrews it talks about you've got to enter into his throne room boldly. We can do it with confidence. And yet we hold back. You see, the thing is, we have this idea that God is angry at us because we're sinners. God is not angry at you. He's angry at what sin does to you. And what sin does to you is it separates you and him. It is always about God's only motivation is he wants you to be in his family because he wants you. That is it. If you want to sum up the entire Bible, God wants you. And he wants you to be with him, and he wants you to enjoy him as much as he enjoys being with you. I'll say it again. He is not angry at you because you're a sinner or you sinned. He is angry at sin and what sin has done to you. And if you walk away today hearing that only thing is that God has never been angry with you. Sin has been dealt with. Jesus has done it. He isn't angry. He's angry at sin because sin separates us from him. And he wants you. And I'm so lost in my notes. Let me just end off with this. God's talking about a shaking. So it talks about the mountain trembled. So he's talking about a shaking. We don't need to be fearful of the shaking. He's shaking the unseen realm. He's not only shaking the earth, the earthly systems, he's shaking the unseen realm. Guess what? The enemy needs to be shaken. He's shaking in his boots. He knows what's coming. That's why he's such a bad loser, and he's desperate for us to stay in the lies that we believe. Because it says we're receiving our rights, but we've already got our rights. It's like we already have it, but then we just continually receiving rights to this unshakable kingdom. So anything that's not of God will be shaken off of you. So you don't have to worry, because what will remain is the real, original you that God has always designed. It says, so we should be extremely thankful and offer God the purest worship. I struggle sometimes when I come into worship and it's been a rough week, and I can think of so many things of why I shouldn't be grateful. This text is telling me completely the opposite. Because physical things are temporary, including this is something to be thankful for. Our bodies are temporary. So, as the older you get, you wake up with an injury rather than actually doing exercise and getting an injury. We're going to get renewed bodies. If there's anything to be grateful for, we'll be grateful for that. The old covenant was earthly, temporary. It was a means to help the Israelites approach God. But we have a way open for us. Why are we not there as often as we can be? We have a confidence. We just need to use it. Confidence is Jesus. Let me end with this story. So 1986, a Texas gem dealer by the name of Roy Wetstein was going at a mineral show in Arizona, and he came through this old Tupperware bowl, and he was going through all these little stones, really, like blinky, when you go to the patch, the scratch patch, he had a little bowl of scratch patch stones. And he comes across this lavender-looking potato-sized stone. So maybe in those days the potatoes were bigger. I don't know. It's not the baby potatoes, the big ones. And he thinks, this looks a little special. So he says to the guy, I can pay you $15 for this. The guy was like, I'll tell you what, I'll do something even better. I'll let you have it for 10, because it's not as pretty as the others. And he walked away with, it turns out, the world's largest star sapphire, valued later at $2.28 million. It was 1.905 carats. And then in its uncut form, he sold it for $1.5 million. And he put it in the profits for his two sons, because they'd each given him $5 each to bring back something for them. If you don't know what you possess, you may risk disregarding it and giving it away for nothing. We don't know the full value of what we have, what we possess as God's children. The rights we have, who we are, and more importantly, who He is. And if we don't dig deep and we don't keep finding out more about Him and declaring and knowing and asking for more experience of His love, because He does love us and He has proven it, if we don't keep digging in this, we run the risk giving it away for $10 when it's worth millions. And in fact, God's kingdom is worth, there are no limits. And I think that's what the Hebrew writer was telling us. So I'm hoping that some of your mind shifts, your grids about this Old Testament God, that He wasn't, you hear the thing, God is the same today, yesterday, and tomorrow. He really is. But the God in the Old Testament is really as awesome as the God in the New Testament. He really is that loving. There is so much grace in the Old Testament. We just need lenses to see it. So the call here is to worship. Because remember, the whole agenda of being at Mount Sinai was worship. I would like us all to stand. If the worship team can come up. I want you to ask God to give you a revelation or let's say a truth bomb about either your value, how he sees you. Ask him, you're holding just close your eyes. And I want you to imagine you holding like a dirty gray stone. But inside there's something special about this stone. I want you to ask God. Because this stone represents you. In his eyes, he knows the value of who you are. You may not. And I want you to ask God, what is the value of this stone? I don't want it to be a numbers thing. And maybe if you are numbers orientated, that'll be. But won't you say, Father, won't you show me what you see when you look at me? And I repent where I have disregarded what I possess from you, this unshakable kingdom, or I've let it go for something far less worth than what it is. I repent for standing off at a distance like the Israelites. Because I've missed you and how amazing you are. Help me, give me courage to step into the fire rather than step away from it. Give me courage to step into your presence and not be a distance from you. Won't you break off every lie that you've revealed to me today about who you are, so that I can come closer, so that I can experience you in a way that I've never experienced you before.